Hi, and welcome to The Fault Line, a CMG consulting podcast exploring the pivotal moments where business strategy meets real-world pressure.
Hello, and welcome back to The Fault Line. You'll notice that we're missing my co-host here today. We've got no Gary Lancina, but we do have a special guest, Pat Fitzgerald, joining us today as we talk about AI and how it supports digital go-to-market. Welcome to the episode, Pat.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for having me.
You want to just give us a little intro of yourself so folks know where you're coming from?
Sure. I am a long-time digital marketing person. I've been in the business for quite a while, both on the agency, consultancy, and a lot of large brands like SiriusXM, NFL Game Pass, CNN. Of late, I've been working with a lot of B2B companies as well, helping them with their go-to-market strategies, particularly around data and marketing technology.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in. Let's talk first about what we won't be talking about today. So today is not going to be all of the AIs taking over the world. Nobody's going to have a job after AI is finished, but it is going to be on the positive ways that we can use technology to help us do things faster, better, more efficiently, especially in the realm of digital go-to-market. I'm going to share just a quick quote from Stuart Russell, a recent podcast I was listening to, Diary of a CEO. And he says, AI can be a power tool for humanity, enabling us to do more and better things than we can do unaided. And so I think today we're going to focus on how we can aid ourselves in doing things better. So let's start out with maybe if you're thinking about how AI can help marketing teams move faster.
Sure. So I will say out of the gate, obviously we all hear a lot about the doom and gloom and the potential end of civilization from AI, but I'm more of a let's call it AI fanboy or positivist, I guess, right? Because if it does end us all, what are we going to do, right? We have to wake up. We got to do work every day, and I'm actually um, feeling sort of a second wind. As I say, I've been at this quite a while, and one of the things I found is all of a sudden with AI, I've got access to an entire marketing team, digital marketing team, up and down, right? And I don't have to, going back to the before times, run around halls and try to find somebody or figure out who I need to call or do research. I get a lot of what I need just by asking my AI GPTs, what do I need to do here and how do I solve that problem? And it accelerates the process for me as I'm working with clients, as I'm working to solve sort of various marketing challenges. And I feel like, if any of us are in the room, there's something that needs attention or needs to get figured out. And this is an accelerant. The obvious places to go in, right, are the GPT tools, right? ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and I'm testing and using a lot of those things and testing them against each other and seeing what I get if I ask the same question to three different AI tools. What am I getting? And I'm finding I'm getting a better synthesis if I look across there.
That's an interesting way of kind of like olden days answer shopping, but through technology, right? So you're asking a bunch of different agents, technology agents,
Yep,
if you
yep.
will, to answer the same question. And I like the kind of visual that you just created where you've got extra brains kind of working for you in parallel, which
Exactly.
helps speed up that process.
Absolutely. And I also think, look, there's inherent challenges, and I know we'll talk more about this, but with biases, with even hallucinations, or making up answers, right, as you go. So using them to check against each other, I think, is important. The other thing, obviously, it's intentional, and these AI companies are working on this, but they make them they make it sticky. And I think this is the difference as we start to move from what you think about as uh, it sounds crazy, but legacy search, right? Where you would just search and go through Google and try to find the answers or go to the sites that you thought. There's a synthesis that's happening, right? So you can kind of go through each one of those things, and as you compare across across different GPTs, chat GPTs, you'll be able to see, sort of different responses to that. So yeah, answer shopping, for sure. And certainly, you get out of the gate, that's really the time efficiency, that you're getting, immediately from that. Now, what I will say, just to frame that, and this is where I do think there is an advantage to folks that have been in business and in marketing for a while, is you have to bring judgment to anything that you're getting from there, right? So I do think, that it does help experienced folks actually scale even more, because you can be a bit more discerning and you're not just taking the answer, that's given to you.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways that our colleagues at CMG have kind of tried to make sure that doesn't happen, right? Building our own custom GPTs is one way of specifically telling it, don't hallucinate information, of
Yeah,
giving it very specific data to use in its application. And I was at a conference last year where there were a bunch of experts on a panel talking about how large the world of AI is, and that we all use it, whether we think we do or not, in our day-to-day lives, but that don't only use it to replace Google search. Use it for, it has so many deeper capabilities, like spend some
absolutely.
time to learn about it. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say about the practical uses as marketers and product managers use it in go-to-market activities.
Sure. Uh, First off, you said, don't hallucinate. The other thing I ask it to do, and not so metaphorically, but is don't wax my car, right? It's I don't want to be patted on the back every time I ask a question, right? I want sort of more of a straight answer, and I think that's part of, it's all training too, right? So we're training these things, and then of course, we get locked into them. More the reason to make sure that you have access to other, or you're using different tools, right? Because you're gonna keep investing in one, and then I often sometimes will have a lot of information in one of the tools, and then just bounce to another one where I have less, just to make sure I'm getting a fresh perspective there, right?
Yeah.
So I think the question here was, how are companies using this, and where do you sort of start, right? Well,
Hmm.
one is just everyone's experimenting with it, as you said, right? So, and I think, without having to do too much evangelism there, especially in marketing and in product, specifically, folks are just picking it up because either they're finding time savings or they're just curious, right? They're GPT curious, so they're sort of jumping in and, asking questions and seeing if they can get some answer. I'll give you one sort of thing that I've started to do that just really shrinks down time. I do a lot of product work. I've done a lot of product management work, and um, writing use cases has always been just the bane of every product manager's existence, right? Well, if you frame it correctly and you're giving it enough information, that gets really shortened, right? And then what you're trying to do with that, obviously, is get information to engineering teams and development teams, or even product marketing teams, right? Which are the features that I need to focus on? Can I write some quick copy around that? So huge ability to accelerate around the product role.
I'm very excited by what you just said, because being an agile coach for many years and trying to
Yeah,
teach teams how to write user stories, and
yeah.
now them having kind of a shortcut that can give them at least the initial set so they're not struggling so hard.
I will say, and now if I'm giving advice to early stage product managers, know what a good use case is first, right? Understand what that is. And then once you understand what that construct is, absolutely use this, right? Um, Without getting too far into a product management discussion, I mean, the job of the product manager is really help to pick the right features, but the other job is feed the engineering team, right? Make sure that they always have the right work, and don't be the bottleneck. This is, now with these kinds of tools, there's no excuse for being a bottleneck, right? It's like, get these things done, and then figure out, okay, how do I add additional information, and how am I validating those things, not just internally with your internal teams, but externally with end users and consumers. So
Yeah, we're going to have you back for another episode to talk just about how we can write use cases and
right
how
on.
QA can be
Okay.
more efficient, because that can take us down a whole rabbit hole for sure.
Exactly. I think the way, though, Kim, to think about that, right, is if I think about even in knowing, CMG and the focus on marketing, really when we're talking especially about our B2B clients, right, it's really about go to market, right? It's really about how do I integrate product, marketing, and sales so that we're driving revenue, we're driving growth, right? So as you look at each one of those disciplines, there's obviously a ton of opportunity in there to use AI to accelerate. Opens up another issue, right? And this is again where it's like, this is not all about replacing people, right? What people do a really good job of is they do a good job of integrating these ideas, right? And managing these processes, right? Here you can get efficiency, you can speed up things, right? But you still need to do that strategic work, that integration work. And that's what people are really good at, right? And
Yeah.
and
So,
using judgment there.
I mean, kind of wrapping a bow around the part that you just said, I think if we engineer the systems we're using so that we can increase the velocity of the road to getting to revenue, which is ultimately where organizations want to be. And these are a set of tools that can help us do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely, right? They can, certainly increase our output, right? They can, I want to say reduce cost. And obviously we're seeing that. You're seeing that in the job market. You're seeing that in the economy as a whole. But I think what we haven't really started to see is the productivity increase that we're going to get out of this, right? And then it just changes. And this has been going on for millennia, right? New things come along and it just changes the way people work. That's where I think we are right now. And if you're doing this in the spaces that we're doing it in B2B and technology and even in consumer, it just opens up a whole bunch of different avenues and where you actually do spend the time to invest, which hopefully is in doing things that are new to the world, innovating and things like that. And yeah, there's some drudgery that we can take out of this. And then there's also some insight that we can drive out of it as well. But that's ultimately about people figuring out how to harness and use those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it is, as you said, it is just one more new tool, and we can be afraid of it and get left behind, or we can adopt it and keep moving faster like everybody else.
And showing some let's call it experience, but time in market. We said a lot of the same things
Yeah,
about the internet when it first came out, right? And
exactly.
obviously this isn't the same thing, and it does a whole lot of different things. In fact, maybe even more fundamentally than the early internet. But we have adapted, we've integrated. You see the hyper growth, and then now we're on to the next thing.
Right. And when we think about in the course of somebody's lifetime, right? When I graduated high school, which was in 1995, for anybody who's curious, America Online was sending discs out, and my friends, who were going away to school or we were just starting college, we were just getting email addresses for the first time. And, that wasn't very long ago.
Not in the scheme of things. No, it
Correct.
wasn't. So yeah.
Yes. Can you give us some kind of real practical, like, what do we mean when we say use AI for digital go to market? So
Sure.
some real
So
things.
we have touched on and talked about generative AI, right? You go to ChatGPT, you put in a prompt, right? And then you start that process, right? And the other great thing about it is it's also prompting you back, asking you additional questions, right? So I do think it does take you deeper, right? And if you're paying attention and you're, using your judgment, right? And filtering what you're seeing, right? Appropriately, right? You're going to get actually a richer product, even just because essentially you've got a partner, right? That is working with you to get more information. So
Yeah. And part of why I'm shaking my head so vigorously is one of my favorite things to do is to write the prompt and then watch what it's saying as it's
spot
working.
on. Spot
Yes.
on. And that is actually important. And I do think just to talk through that a little bit, right? Um I'm sort of, channeling old school education where like you wrote a term paper and you had to have sources, you had to
Yes.
cite it, right? Um, and I think especially when you're well, across the board, whether you're in marketing or you're consulting, you're with an agency, you have to actually be paying attention. The good news is it's saving all of those things for you,
Hmm.
right? And you need to understand the sources because at some point you will get called out on it, and you need to be able to have a record. Actually, engineers have a really good method for this in the way that they work with code around GitHub or something
Yep.
like that, where you're putting things in a repository and you know the versions and you can source things. And you do the same thing with data. Scientists do the same thing with data. They store the data set, right? So that somebody can go back and review it. You have to think in those kinds of terms when you're using this as a business professional and a practitioner, that you could get called out on this, right? So make sure that you're saving it and you're checking the sources and the thinking that it's doing, right? So that if you go back or if there's a question, you can go back and find it. We all want to go faster. The issue with speed, though, is you will make mistakes from time to time. We have to be okay with some of that, right?
Yeah. So
And
it's like
managing
we're all
mistakes.
engineers and we all have to now comment our code in this world.
And it's doing it for you,
Yes.
which is cool, but just don't ignore it, right? Just
Hmm.
make sure you're there and looking at that, right? So I think that's an important thing, particularly around the generative things again, which is getting much more wider use, right? If I then kind of move down and we talked about go to market and where you start to apply that. Um, I do a ton of web work, and that includes figuring out demand generation, right? Strategies, right? Which are really now, especially when you're in the B2B space, very content heavy, right? Well, you're creating content because you want to engage and get your prospects and your customers to do that. By the way, everybody else is doing the same thing,
Yes.
right? Okay. So how do you actually start to apply this and say, okay, I want to get really sharp around my ideal customer, my ICP. How am I talking to them? How am I doing that differently? Because everybody else is doing this too. So let's not all have the same thing. So you have to actually use the judgment around how you're creating that content, using it as a start, right? And then coming up with ways that you're differentiating around that. And then the other thing, we don't do that just cause, right? We don't create that content. If you want to do that, you'd be a novelist, right? Or you'd be a playwright, right? We're trying to do this because we're actually trying to drive sales at some point, right? So how are we using it to differentiate? How are you integrating SEO into that? And the SEO tools are we saw Adobe bought SEMrush, right? Um, so, clearly they're thinking about how content creation, right, affects the way we're driving traffic into the website. And how are you as a business or a marketer using that to differentiate yourself from your nearest competitors, right? Or even the vast sea of things that are out there and the jargon that we're developing every single day around this.
Yeah. And as a point in time, right, there's so much more information coming at us digitally that trying to find just whether it's, share of wallet when you're talking about how much people are spending, but in this case, share of brain space. So we have to be so much more precise and targeted if we have a hope and a dream of getting a portion of somebody's brain space to pay attention to the messaging we're trying to share.
100%. And then let's take that, sort of to the next level, right? Because if you are thinking about SEO or the content you're creating, you now have to not just consider, okay, how is Google, reading this and
Ranking.
ranking it? And I will say, just as a plug, that is still important, even though the share of this SEO traffic is cratering. And I've seen this across clients, right? The organic traffic to websites from Google search in particular is actually kind of on a ski slope, because these generative tools are taking that share. Those tools are still using the crawling websites to capture that. So you still have to consider those sort of practices. But the thing that they're doing is they're answering questions. So when you start to think about content in this way, it still comes down to people consuming the content in this case. So how are you actually answering the key questions for your customers, right? For your ideal customer, you have to answer their questions, and certainly more competitive, but you have to be thinking about how am I going to get into these chat engines, right? Into these GPTs so that I actually get there, because eventually they're going to say, well, I got to buy something to solve the problem. And if you're recognized here, then the next step would be obviously to go to those folks that answered, go to those companies that answered that question.
So, what are some of the watch outs or kind of risks? We talked a little bit about the trusted source of information, but beyond
Hmm.
that, there's always kind of a fear of adoption, especially maybe in some legacy organizations where they've done things a certain way all along, or in heavy compliance organizations where
Hmm.
there's a fear of what GPT might learn about them or things like that. So, what are some of those watch outs?
Let's start with the immediate fears and concerns, right? And then, how to sort of mitigate those. I think first and foremost, we talked about hallucination, and actually, I think that's something obviously that the AI companies are well aware of and working to mitigate and things like that, right? I think that part fixes itself in time. Not that it shouldn't be checked, but it, I think that mitigates in time just because there'll be some more governors around that within the tools themselves. I shouldn't have to tell it not to hallucinate, as an example. Don't make stuff up. Depends on the time and day of the week.
Yes.
Um, so I do think that there's two really fundamental things. I started early in entertainment and software development, and I actually do believe in I'm just going to call it the sanctity of intellectual property, right?
Okay.
It's based on the ideas that people have, and people should be able to own those ideas, right? So as you're, using these things to aggregate information around this, you're using it to write copy, right? Well, let's make sure that somebody else didn't say that, right? And that, that you're not integrating somebody's ideas, right? Academics think a lot about that, right? And a lot of them, they get called out for it because you want to give credit where credit is due. And I think in marketing in particular, it's easy to just kind of mush stuff together. You're under time pressure, right? But be really cautious of that for two reasons. And I'll, whatever. One, just because, I think, we should
Plagiarism's
have some
bad. Yes.
plagiarism bad, right?
Yes.
You should have some, ethics around,
Hmm.
making sure that you credit people on the things that they create. Um, the second thing is actually more pragmatic. So if you're not so concerned about the moral implications, think about the legal and financial implications. You can get sued, right? So there, you do have to be cautious of that. And the bigger the company, the more, the legal team is going to be weighing in on those kinds of things, right? And checking you. And at some point, we've got to be able to move fast, but you also have to have those checks in place.
Yeah. So, can we use Gen AI tools to help us check for plagiarism?
There are tools that do it. Actually, Grammarly has tools that do that for you. It just as a common example. There are other ones out there, right? But it says, check this, for AI. My daughter is a budding professor, and she teaches undergraduates, and she
Yeah.
uses tools when she gets the term paper to check against, did you guys go out and do this, right? They're not saying don't use AI, but they're saying, again, give credit where credit's due and make sure you're not just conflating somebody else's work, or, honestly, just taking credit for somebody else's work in this. So that's one. And that's on the stuff you're ingesting and taking in, right?
Hmm.
The other area is your own, and this gets into, especially with technology companies, right? And financial services companies and everybody else, you have your own proprietary data and proprietary information and proprietary processes. And everybody's going to want to take their internal data, right, and get that into AI so that you can create new capabilities from that. And we need to be able to do that. But at some point, you really have to, and this is where, like, a paid license, right, or an enterprise license versus just the freebies, right? So you
Hmm.
upload it into Gemini, and it's like, all right, well, that's it. Now it's up there, and because you're not paying for it, or you don't have an enterprise license, right, it just becomes part of the overall body of content, right? And while that might get diluted off of all the other things that are out there, if somebody's doing something pretty specific, you have risk there.
Can we make that like super real?
Sure.
So, if I'm going to kind of try to give an example and you tell me if I'm way off.
Hmm.
We've got let's say, a hospital system that is trying to figure out how to communicate uh, the exceptional patient care that they provide in a specific field.
Hmm.
And they use a free license of GPT instead of something else. And they upload documentation that they would give to patients that's specific to their hospital system. They upload into it, let's say, other brand guides and things like that, and they're still using the free version. What happens then is that information becomes part of the public domain and can be discoverable by their competitors.
Uh, Absolutely, and I think they probably violated any number of HIPAA compliance rules as
Yeah.
well, right? So,
Hopefully they didn't put patient data, but just
yeah, but I
patient
mean, yeah. So
reading materials.
right. So look, there all of these things, and we talked about GPTs, right? And developing your own, right? Developing your own set of prompts and things like that, right? I think you always have to check off and say, okay, how is this gonna end up in the wider sphere? And am I giving away things, right, from a value perspective, for my particular business or enterprise? And those things are evolving in terms of what you can and can't do. But the one thing it does say is you should be familiar with the licenses that you have and what does that AI company, what can and can't they do with the data, right? I do think increasingly there's going to be roles in especially larger organizations. They're going to want to take advantage of this, right? Financial services, probably, big one, right? In terms of they're going to have folks that are going to be dedicated to this and they're going to be building their own models internally. And then they're going to be using some open source stuff, but they're going to want to make sure that whatever's theirs, because they're going to have large quantities of data, but whatever's theirs stays within their kind of call it virtual walls.
Any other watch outs for our audience to be thinking of?
Um, on the generative side, oh yeah, on the generative side is bias, right? I mean, all of these things are, they're written by human beings, right? The LLMs, and then it's also, the other thing to remember is, it's using what's already out there, right? And we know everybody, humans, we all have biases and things like that, and you're never going to be able to filter all of that out, right? But especially in marketing where you're doing things that, you're trying to connect with folks and they're going to be public eventually or whatever, take a beat and say, is this going to make sense? Does this make sense? And then again, this is where you get outside your own desktop, right? And talk to other folks and get a read on that before you start to, actually go and distribute marketing things. And it could be something, innocuous, like this is just an email in a CRM stream, in a nurture stream, and who's going to read it or what? Well, if somebody does and it looks stupid or it looks, it can be interpreted differently.
Yeah, it only takes one customer to interpret
Yeah, and then the
something,
next thing you know,
and it's all, and
you're the
then that's
subject of,
discoverable.
yeah, an X storm or a tweet storm, as we used to be
Yeah.
called.
Um, are there like one or two things that you would suggest, whether it's marketing leaders or product managers, should they be doing today, or someplace they can
Absolutely.
start tomorrow?
Yes. So we talked about product, right, in terms of use cases, right? Well, marketing has a ton of use cases, right? You have content creation, right? There is so much workflow in marketing, right? I think when we're in school studying marketing, we're like, I'm going to be creative. And then you get into it and you're like, man, this is just a lot of sausage making.
Hmm.
um, and to take a look at that and say, okay, where can I actually get some efficiencies if people weren't, have hands all over this, right? So, as a marketing leader, as a CMO, I would look at all the functions that I'm doing, right? From strategy and research, right? All the way down to marketing operations, right? Where I'm just getting the emails out. All of those things. And I would look and say, okay, if I challenge my team, right? Where can you get either increases in productivity or increases in efficiency, right? And think outside the box and all the kind of applications that you could potentially do. And everybody pick one and let's like take a look. And where there's connected, where there's connections across groups, figure out where those handshakes are. And the two places, right? Obviously, we're thinking about generative AI and how can I more efficiently create good content that gets consumed by the right people, right? That would be a place. The other place I would look is just data, web data, or any kind of marketing data that we're getting, of which we're all overwhelmed and then trying to figure out how to make sense of it. Can I ingest this into AI and can I get some insight out of it? And you can already see these things coming into Excel and Google Sheets and things like that. Start to test some things out, and how do I start to scale that again with the idea of like make sure you're not loading up proprietary data into the wider universe. And then the area I like to spend a lot more time on, because I do think that this is where there's opportunities for efficiency, is workflow, right? And that goes from automation, right? So how can I use, tools like Zapier, things like that, to actually move data into different places and actually get it out in a more efficient way? It's not AI per se, but it's, getting more AI enabled. And then I think the really interesting spaces are the agentic AI, right? Where you're doing things like you're using what we would have called chatbots or other things, and you're testing those things, but you're using them, let's say, as a business development rep. How could I use this as from an SDR or a BDR perspective, right? How do I use these things as, let's say, a web analyst with an expertise in SEO, and how am I getting more, and what do I need to do to be able to connect those things in, right? So that's actually, to me, that's really the next space, and not even the next. You should be looking at those areas and testing them.
And I think part of embedded in what you were just saying is there's a lot of existing business tools that have now AI features as part of them. Whether we even think about, you're in a Teams meeting and you've got Copilot running in your Teams meeting.
Yep.
So if you're having brainstorming conversations or new product development conversations, how can that aid you in what did you not hear as a human in the conversation that occurred? All the way down to, everything. HubSpot's got AI tools built into it, everything.
HubSpot, I got to say, I'll give them a little shout. I think, and that's where these things all start to integrate into everything. But I think HubSpot, because it is something that mid-size organizations are using and get their heads around, and it's well divided into Sales Hub and Marketing Hub and Service Hub. I think they're integrating some really interesting things, and it's fairly open too, so you can add other stuff into it. So if it is a B2B organization and you're using HubSpot, I think you'll see a lot of opportunity to test some of these things. And I would say test first, right? Like set up pilots, but anything you do, it's like, the tendency is I just start hitting keys and moving things around and seeing, and then if you're like me, you end up in a wormhole, hours later going, I don't think I actually got anything done. But if you zoom out, but it was super fun. But if you level up and you actually say, okay, how am I going to measure this and to see whether it works? And then if we measure it, then you start to get better at it, right? Or you start to find where the applications are. So you take a step out and you say, okay, how would I pilot this? How do I test it? And if I am going to test it, how am I going to evaluate it? And I think a lot of things start to clarify in that regard.
Great. Well, I really appreciate your time today. Traded one silver-haired man for another, but it was a great conversation.
Thanks.
You. I hope you all found value in this episode today. You can find us at cmgconsulting.com or also on LinkedIn and everywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining us.